Wow, imagine living in 1757 during the French and Indian War. Lake George can be considered one of the most dangerous, wild, and active places in American history. Fort William Henry, made famous by the novel The Last of the Mohicans, was a big part of that history. British Indian agent Sir William Johnson led troops to the victory at the Battle of Lake George in September 1755. They captured the French commander Baron d'Esquet. Because of this, the governor of New France ordered Fort Carillon, known as Ticonderoga, to be constructed at the south end of Lake Champlain. In response to this, Johnson ordered Fort William Henry to be built at the southern shore of Lake George. Its walls were 30 feet thick, consisting of earth faced with timber. It was only meant to hold 400 to 500 men. Completed in November 1755, it was a pretty formidable fort, but was only intended to repel Native American attacks. It was not constructed to withstand enemy artillery. Built facing the lake, it had 3 sides with a dry moat. Access to the fort was provided by a bridge crossing the ditch. On March 1757, the French on their first attack were turned back because they lacked heavy guns. Colonel George Monroe took command in the spring of 1757. He had about 1,500 men at his disposal. He was supported by Webb, who was at Fort Edward. They were alerted to a French buildup. Monroe dispatched a force up the lake, which was routed at the Battle of Sabbath Day Point on July 23rd. Webb ordered 200 regulars and 800 Massachusetts militiamen to reinforce Monroe's garrison. Had about 2,500 men, but several hundred were ill with smallpox. On July 30th, French commander Marquis de Montcalm ordered an advance force to move south. They arrived 3 miles within Fort William Henry on August 1st. 2 days later, they skirmished with the Massachusetts militia. They were able to maintain a blockade. Montcalm demanded Monroe's surrender. This request was refused, and Monroe sent messengers south to Fort Edward to seek aid from Webb. Assessing the situation and lacking sufficient men to both aid Monroe and cover the colonial capital of Albany, Webb responded on August 4th. He told them to seek the best surrender terms possible if forced to capitulate. However, the message was intercepted by Montcalm. They now knew that no aid was coming. Monroe was isolated. Montcalm commenced his siege operation, digging trenches northwest of the fort, readying guns to reduce the northwest bastion of the fort. On August 5th, the first battery opened fire and battered the fort's walls from a range of about 2,000 yards away. A second battery opened fire on these walls. It was only 900 or so feet away, which is on today's Shepherd Park. Though Fort William Henry's guns responded, their fire proved relatively ineffective. The defense was hampered by a large portion of the garrison that was ill, as we talked about. Hammering the walls throughout the night of August 6th and 7th, the French succeeded in opening several gaps. On August 7th, Montcalm dispatched his aide to again call for the fort's surrender. It was refused. After enduring another day and night of bombardment, and with the fort's defenses being obliterated, the French trenches came closer and closer. Monroe decided to hoist a white flag on August 9th. Montcalm granted Monroe the honors of war, which allowed them to keep their muskets, possessions, and 1 ceremonial cannon, but no ammunition. In addition, they were to be escorted to Fort Edward and were prohibited from fighting for 18 months. The British were to release the French prisoners in their custody. Housing the British garrison in the entrenched camp, Montcalm had difficulty explaining his terms to his Native American allies, which came from about 30 different nations. They were not happy. They were promised spoils of war and scalps. As the British evacuated the fort, the Native Americans and Canadians surrounded the fort, entered, began looting and killing many of the British sick and wounded that had been left behind. It is said that they also may have dug up some graves and scalped the dead, taking blankets and clothing. Many of the dead that they had dug up might have had smallpox, and this was transmitted later. They were increasingly unable to control the Native Americans. They entered the southeastern Rocky British camp where most of the soldiers were located. They were eager to plunder and get scalps. Montcalm and Monroe decided to attempt to move the garrison south that night. This plan, however, failed when the Native Americans became aware of the British movement. They waited a horribly long night until dawn on August 10th. The column, which included women and children, formed and was provided with about a 200-man escort by Montcalm. Native Americans, with their tomahawks and hatchets, hovered about the column, which began moving towards the military road south. As it exited camp, the Native Americans entered, demanding the possessions including clothing, hats, swords, and bags. They then turned towards the 17 wounded soldiers that were to be taken care of by the French doctors. They began killing and scalping them. They then fell upon the rear of the column, which largely consisted of militia. While some of the French officers attempted to halt the Native Americans, others simply stepped aside. Massachusetts Colonel Joseph Fry reported that he was stripped of much of his clothing and repeatedly threatened. He fled into the woods and did not reach Fort Edward until the 12th of August. He wrote, "At last, with great difficulty, the troops got from the retrenchment, but they were no sooner out than the savages killing and scalping, which occasioned an order for a halt. Done in great confusion at last, but as soon as those in front knew what was doing in the rear, they again pressed forward, and thus the confusion continued and increased till we came to the advance guard of the French. The savages still carrying away officers, privates, women, and children, some of which they later killed and scalped in the road. This horrid scene of blood and slaughter obliged our officers to apply to the French guard for protection, which they refused, told them they must take to the woods and shift for themselves." With Native American attacks increasing in intensity, the column began to dissolve as many of the British soldiers fled into the woods for their lives. Some men, all of the women and children, servants, slaves, allied natives were dragged off. Some were taken prisoner, but most were scalped and killed. Pushing on, Monroe reached Fort Edward with around only 500 people. By the end of the month, about 1,700 of the fort's 2,300-man garrison had arrived at Fort Edward, with many making their own way through the woods. Some estimates place losses during the massacre of August 10th to around 180 plus killed. Unlike the last of the Mohicans where Monroe was killed, he actually survived the massacre. However, he died suddenly in Albany just 3 months later, on the 3rd of November, 1757, of a brain hemorrhage. Following the British departure, Montcalm ordered Fort William Henry dismantled and destroyed. The remains of Fort William Henry laid untouched for approximately 200 years. Then in the 1950s, when the site was excavated, a replica of the fort was built. Now here's a story that you won't hear by watching a movie.
Wondering why did they bother to dig a well here when Lake George is right there? Lake George's waters are still so clean and pure that the breweries along the lake use the water when they make their beer. So you can imagine how nice it was back in 1755 when there weren't 10,000 boats on it every day in the summer. Well, the issue was it was the winter of 1755. There were about 4 feet of ice covering that lake. It was very impractical and dangerous to send men out just to get buckets of water so that everyone could drink. There were Native and French patrols in the area. Just built this fort on a swamp. And so they weren't drinking nice, clear lake water, they were actually drinking swamp water. It's not a good thing to drink. It was also around that time, as the water kept getting worse, that they realized that they had dug their latrines too close to the fort. And the sewage from the latrines was running into the swamp and then filling their well. So they were drinking sewage swamp water. Also, men did die during that first winter. It was against British military regulations to bury men inside the fort, and it was too dangerous to bury them outside the fort. We have about 4 to 5 feet of permafrost here. It's very hard ground. So they couldn't go out and bury the men outside the fort because, again, there were Native and French patrols waiting to pick people off. So they decided to toss the bodies over the wall, and during the summer, they would go out and bury the dead then. Except throughout human history, nice weather always means fighting weather, and so they never got the chance to. And those bodies started to decompose in the sun, and they sank into the swamp and went into their well water. And so the men here were drinking dead body sewage swamp water. I do not recommend drinking dead body sewage swamp water. You will get dysentery, basically defecating yourself to death. It's not a good way to go. So we often hear disembodied footsteps, especially making the trek from the main entrance to this well. It wasn't just the British soldiers inside the fort using this well for their clean drinking water, but the encampment outside of 2,000 or so provincial soldiers and their families, the camp followers, the wives, mothers, sisters, and children who followed the camp to this area, were also using this well. So there was a lot of foot traffic through this area, and we still have a lot of foot traffic today. As you can see, it's a wide open space. It's very difficult to hide here, and so it's very easy to see that the footsteps that you're hearing have no body attached to them. We actually had a group stay overnight. They were reenactors, so they were here for Siege Week, which takes place in August. And they asked if they could stay in our North Barracks for the evening, just to experience what it was actually like to stay here at the fort. And we said, sure, go for it. It was a very, very warm evening. I opened all the windows and the doors to get a cross breeze coming in off the lake. Now, they reported that they heard footsteps out in the parade grounds. And so they came out to look, and they couldn't find anyone. They heard footsteps, couldn't find anyone, went back to bed. They heard footsteps again a little while later, out in the parade grounds. It sounded like marching. They even heard footsteps on the stairs. Find anyone. They went back to bed. They started to hear footsteps in the room they were sleeping in, as well as out here in the parade grounds. There was no one around. And so they gave up on sleeping because they were too spooked. They brought their camp chairs out and set them up around the well, and they talked through the night. But they said that they kept hearing footsteps, marching, even some running on the parade ground and on the walls. They heard whispered orders. They even heard gunfire from Battlefield Park. Needless to say, they have never asked to stay here since then. So they do still come to Siege Week, but they just haven't come back inside the fort, and I don't particularly blame them.
Thanks to Fort William Henry, Lake George has become a tourist destination from people all over the world. All the cannons, soldiers, and the atrocity of war have been replaced with tour cruises, ice cream, and pizza. That is strange indeed. Well, thanks for watching. We'll keep the videos coming here on Strange History. Hey, check out our video about the Battle of the Crater. You'll really dig it.